Welcome back to our channel. We want to thank you for watching. In this episode, we shall be looking at the reason why Africa is paying the price for climate change. As the world continues to warm, somebody's got to pay for that bill, and someone else will need to suffer for the consequences of development and also industrializations that characterize advanced nations. One continent is paying the price extensively, and that is the continent of Africa. The question here is, somebody's got to pay for this, and the money is not forthcoming. If you look at Glasgow, if you also look at Paris, and if you look at Egypt most recently, the $100 billion that was pledged, the money is not forthcoming. However, some countries will need to sacrifice advancement, development, and growth to also save the climate. And this continent of Africa is paying the price, from countries like Malawi, Zambia, Ghana, and the rest of the continent. Africa cannot continue to pay the price when industrialization has benefited a few. Let's listen to what this expert have to say, and we will jump into the entirety of the video.
Africa alone loses $7 to $15 billion a year because of climate change. And that's going to rise to about almost $50 billion a year by 2040. So the world has to meet its commitment, the developed countries, of the $100 billion. I mean, it's a very small amount of money compared to the scale of the problem. But by not meeting it, it has a crisis of trust in developing countries.
But the big question here experts are asking is, the continent of Africa is already paying a heavy price for the effects of a climate crisis it did not cause. During COP27 in Egypt, that took place on November 6 to 18, African countries were set to demand a fair energy transition, prioritizing access to electricity for 600 million people. But that goes a long way to say that should the development of Africa be put on hold until the climate is saved, thanks to broken promises and double talks conversation around the transition to a carbon neutral world that has become increasingly difficult for African governments to accept this proposal. The continent suffered during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the governments are aware that crisis could be around the corner. We must agree, according to an African president, that what a transition for Africa is and what are the quotes, and the discussion must take place in open doors. According to the former Senegalese president Macky Sall, who warned on behalf of the continent of Africa that the transition should be taken with a grain of salt. It's not as if there is no money. There is enough money out there. The question is, why are the rich countries not paying their fair share as results to the development and the impact they have on the climate? Let's listen to what the presidents have to say.
You know, as President Macron, as I said, I don't think you're going to have a lot of new announcements made. I think the issues announcement that needs to be made have been made. I think it's more about commitment, you know, and looking for ways, in particular, of how we are going to engage the private sector, because that's the key, right? I mean, you look at the world today, you have $145 trillion of assets under management by institutional investors. It's going to rise to that by 2026, which is just 3 years down the line. So it's very massive.
Let's take a step back with regards to the climate issue. If you look at figures, Africa accounts for 3% of the world's total cumulative greenhouse gases emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The continent is on the front line of the climate crisis, for which it is footing the bill itself at the expense of other priorities. Other African countries are already forced to spend between 2% and 5% of their gross domestic product each year to deal with the problem they did not cause, according to the African Development Bank. This is one of the most shocking injustices against the continent of Africa. According to Moussa Faki, the African Union's chairperson, who actually chaired the African Union Commission, said at the summit on Africa's adaptation held in Rotterdam in the Netherlands in September, which the heads of state of industrialized countries had not deemed fit to attend at the time. If you look at different aspects, For hundreds of millions of Africans, the cost of the climate crisis is pushing away hopes of being able to live in dignity and benefiting from quality healthcare and education services to an ever more distant horizon. Despite the progress made in recent decades, 33 countries out of 54 countries in the continent of Africa still belong to the category of least developed countries. Africa is suffering incredibly with regards to the climate issue, and the continent cannot solve it alone. And the continent of Africa will need to go through those particular transitions that are relevant. This has made some African leaders to actually lash out on this particular issue without even thinking twice.
The essential human qualities of innovation and adaptation must be evident in the actions we take to prevent the destruction of our planet. Africa is warming faster than the rest of the world. We are told that the 20 climate hotspots in the world that we have, we find 17 of them in Africa. Africa is least responsible for the climate damage that has been caused, and yet it bears the greatest burden. Centuries after the end of the slave trade, decades after the end of the colonial exploitation of Africa's resources, the people of our continent are once again bearing the cost of industrialization of the North and the development of the wealthy nations of the world. This is a price that the people of Africa are no longer prepared to pay. Many countries in the North count their assets in the mineral resources that are beneath the African soil. The wealth of Africa belongs to Africans. The mineral wealth that is beneath the soil of Africa must, in the end, accrue to Africans. We urge global leaders to accelerate the global decarbonization while pursuing equality and shared prosperity. We need to advance all three pillars of the Paris Agreement: mitigation, adaptation, and support, with equal ambition and urgency. African countries, alongside other developing economy countries, need increased financial support to both implement the 2030 Agenda and to achieve their climate change goals in a comprehensive and integrated manner.
A comprehensive and integrated manner. You heard it there. The bottom line here is that somebody's got to pay the price, and that price tag is on the head of the African continent, and that is the reason why they have been pushed to curtail on their energy infrastructure, on their fossil fuel and other ways. This question here is Africa should approach energy issues with care, because the development of Africa and saving the planet, it's on both sides. Africa needs to make the right decision. African countries cannot compromise their development and growth and advancement just because they have to sacrifice for the climate. The people who also have polluted the climate and also make the world warm must pay. I agree with the French president, President Macron, in this case, who clearly said that there must be a balance between development and also growth and with regards to climate. These African countries must listen carefully, because in this case it's clearly important for their own future and for the future of the African continent. They should approach this with regards to the wealth they have on their ground and make use of it, not to compromise the development and growth about climate, and alongside creating jobs with their resources and infrastructure. Let's listen to what the French president have to say, and we will join you again on the other side.
Trying to get some kind of agreement about what to do about climate change, about debt relief, poverty reduction. Isn't the fundamental problem you face that in the wealthy countries of the world, the domestic politics right now does not allow for a massive expansion of aid, and you need a lot of money to solve the kind of problems you're talking about?
Look, I think this summit is a very important moment for at least two reasons, if I may say. The first one, geopolitics. There is a big risk of a global divide because of the war in Ukraine and the whole dynamic. And this divide is the West against the rest. And this narrative is pushed by some big countries, I would say, for several reasons. But listening to a lot of leaders during the past year, I was very upset by this narrative of double standard. And a lot of leaders in this world said to us, you have a lot of billions for Ukraine, but when the question is to fix poverty, climate change, climate vulnerability in our country, it takes years or decades to find a few millions. This is quite true.
Actually, you've heard it there yourself. This is where the problem lies. The double standard that most developing countries, especially in Africa, are talking about this climate issue. There is enough money to fund other activities, like the President of France just pointed out. But to solve the issues that are affecting humanity, it's so difficult to find a few billions, as he puts it. Mr. Macron actually accepted that Europe and developed countries are completely aware of the impact of climate and how this is going to affect the developing economies. But the question here is to put the hands into the pocket to bring up 100 billion annually that has been talked about over the years. That's not coming out. So this is where the problem is. Now people will understand why some African countries are not happy with regards to developed countries finding it so difficult to get this money. But it's okay to also bring out hundreds of billions of dollars to also fund other activities which others will question that what is important. Is it war or also to save the climate? Rich nations must make that decisions. Otherwise, African countries will be proving to be more resistant in regards to the climate issue. Let's listen to what the president have to conclude, and we will join you on the other side again.
I think we are right to do what we are doing for Ukraine because we are fighting for international law, for our liberty and our principles, and for a country being aggressed. But let's be clear, we were not sufficiently efficient vis-à-vis the South and a lot of countries facing poverty and climate change at the same time. So we have to address this narrative of double standard, otherwise it will be used by some others to create an alternative multilateral order. New financial institutions, new global order, and to say World Bank, IMF, even United Nations are no more efficient to fix our big issues, let's create something else. This is the number one reason for me, this forum, gathering from the US to China, to South Africa, Brazil, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the Europeans and so on, a lot of countries, very poor to very rich, to build together a new consensus.
Like the African Development Bank president actually points out, there must be some element of honesty and transparency with regards to how the world wants Africa to approach this climate transition thing. According to the IPCC scientists, most African countries will experience climatic conditions of unprecedented temperatures earlier in the century than rich countries located in northern latitude. The upheavals will be reflected in an increase in the number of days in the years when the average temperature exceeds a threshold considered later for humans, between 50 and 100 days in West Africa for a warming of 1.6 degrees Celsius, between 100 and 150 days in Central Africa in a scenario of a 2.5 degrees Celsius increase, and 200 to 300 days in the tropical belt in temperatures soar by more than 4 degrees Celsius. That is the reason why some African leaders have decided that they will not take this particular request by rich countries, especially the president of Zimbabwe, who clearly said this.
Mr. President, what is becoming apparent in light of the Sustainable Development Goals is that many African countries are not going to meet the targets by 2030. The question to you, sir, is, looking ahead, where do you see opportunities for greater collaboration amongst African leaders to ensure that we get back on track as much as possible?
Well, thank you again for that question. As my brother has said, COP26 ended up with the third world countries, Africa and some countries in Asia, and so Latin America, on one side, and the first world on the other. And I may have misunderstood, but I felt that the first world was looking at us jumping, leapfrogging to embrace green energy, clean energy. And yet, they themselves, when they developed, there's a history of how they developed to where they are. And in that process, they used the thermal power. And now we are at a stage where most of our African countries have coal and we use thermal power, and they were told this is dangerous. We, as my brother said, they made commitments. If indeed they honor the commitments, well and good, we'll then use their finance to generate green energy. But in the absence of that, I, for one, would not abandon using thermal power in order to modernize and industrialize Zimbabwe. I'm fully aware that as a result of the problems in Europe, some of the countries who are speaking at COP16 are going back to thermal power currently. So this is the example of double standards. It is critically important that we both understand it is necessary that, of course, we move on. But we must be allowed, be given transition, a reasonable transition to move away from thermal power to green energy.
Hopefully we've informed you in regards to this particular crisis issue regarding climate transition and why African countries are hesitant to embrace this particular issue and why they are pushing back, because the future and development of their continent lies with regards to an important decision that should be made. African countries have enormous resources and they also have to exploit that. A smooth transition will mean that the developed and wealthy countries must pay for that transition, as Africa will be the one to pay the price. Want to thank you for watching. Leave us a comment, keep the conversation going, watch other informative video on our YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye bye.